Welcome to episode 6 of Cultural Luminaries. I'm delighted to greet you today. My name is Jyoti Jani, and I'm the founder of Spill Play, a Seattle-based organizational design and play consultancy. And today I am delighted to welcome a very special guest to our show where we explore. Cultural Luminaries is really about exploring how empathy, innovation, and cultural transformation are shaping the future of work, society, and leadership. And today I have a very special guest, Aubrey Blanche-Sarellano. And Aubrey, you'll have to correct me if I said your name incorrectly. But Aubrey is a math nerd and empath, aka MathPath, who helps organizations build equitable processes, products, experiences, and operations. Her work combines an empathetic and intersectional approach with social scientific methods to create meaningful, sustainable change with a focus on environmental, social governance, and people operations. So this covers everything from fair talent processes and bias-resistant product design to equitable algorithmic design, super important in the age of AI, as well as communication strategy. So very broad base of work. And what I love most about Aubrey is she's a very real voice in a sea of people conforming. And Aubrey has always been such an inspiration to me as a leader in the people and culture space, because she is just an all-around amazing human. So Aubrey, thank you so much and welcome to my show.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. I was so excited to get in conversation, I think, because the work that you do is so important. And I think it's really easy in the current climate where we're seeing tightening of the belt. In a lot of ways, we're seeing backlash against this kind of empathy and care at work. And so talking about this, I think, is more important than ever. And I think it's really, really important because a lot of people see this as, oh, this is going to be expensive or take a lot of time. And I actually just don't think that humanity at work needs to be either of those things.
Yes. I mean, it's funny because as a systems change practitioner, as a culture change practitioner, we talk a lot about processes, right? Like we're here today to talk about performance management and some of the ways that we can operationalize equity. But one of the reasons I love play and creativity is that we can't go out into the world and change systems and structures and processes unless we're embodied. And a lot of us are walking around in our heads in a super cerebral culture, disconnected, disassociated, in a chronic state of fight, fawn, or freeze. And that's not, without the foundation of embodiment, we can't change these systems. We can't change the processes. We can't show up interpersonally the way that we need to. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but that's my soapbox piece.
No, I think you should stay on the soapbox. And I think where, because of the work that I do, the lens I always have is, and who even has the opportunity to be embodied at work, right? Because I think it's really important that we talk about this idea of embodiment of presence, which leads to cognitive performance, which is good for work, right? Like there's a very clear through line, but that ability to be embodied and present is not just kind of an individual skill thing. And I know that you know this, but this is kind of for folks on the call, is that it's really an interplay between the environment that you're in first, because your unconscious mind is scanning the environment for danger, for risk, for belonging, for all of these things that you are programmed in for humans to care about. And so that's a lot of my work is I definitely care about the interpersonal. Like I don't want to diminish that community connection, like individual work piece. But a lot of what my work looks at is actually that environment or structural aspect. So how do we build a safe, supportive container or set of like architecture that allows that interpersonal interaction to be positive and that personal embodiment to be realized. So I just want to talk about like there's different levels of analysis, and my work tends to move with that very structural design element, because I think it's often devalued, and I think in a really problematic way, the like do this be better is put on the individual when the environment isn't conducive to the individual doing something effectively.
Oh, preach. Yeah, the framework that I've developed to accompany my book is very in line with existing systems frameworks. And I talk about the three layers of systems change: the personal, the interpersonal, as well as the systemic and the institutional. And all three layers are required, to really change systems. And so I love that I get to talk to you today. Your story that in my book is featured in, of course, in the systems layer of the book, which speaks to how you're showing up today. But all three layers are important, and I think in any healthy organization, we need to seek out and understand how we're part of a community, a larger movement, people working together. And I feel happy knowing that people like you are doing the systems work, because yeah, it takes all of us at different operating at different levels, or sometimes at all three at the same time. So we like skipped straight into it, but I didn't get to ask you my first question that I ask all of my guests. And this show is called Cultural Luminaries, and so the question is, tell our audience, Aubrey, what is lighting you up as a leader these days? What's lighting you up?
Wow. I think right now it's January, so it's a little bit of like strategy and visioning time. And so from a work context, my team is just incredible. Like I get to work with this group of like really badass humans who are all kind of specialists in their own domains. And we kind of came together as a team about a year ago, and I really see them starting to like cross collaborate and work together in a way that makes me really excited, where you can kind of see everybody learning from each other, but also bringing their kind of unique genius to what they do. And so it's kind of hard to not just feel really excited about what you can accomplish when you have like amazing people working together really well. So I feel like really honored and kind of like, how do I earn like the privilege of leading and supporting this group of people? So that's kind of where I'm sitting work wise. I also have a couple of clients that I'm working with. And the thing that I really love about my consulting practice is I've kind of built a very specific brand around what I do. And it means that, like, I don't necessarily get all of the clients, but the ones that come through are really incredibly smart about the systems design that they want to do. And so we end up getting to do really cool, innovative stuff. And so I just get like intellectually and emotionally excited about kind of learning about someone's problem and being able to say, like, actually, this is solvable. And it's pretty straightforward if we just apply the right thinking to it. So I've got a lot of kind of cool irons in the fire right now.
Of course you do. I wouldn't have expected anything less. No, the people aspect of our work and who we work with really is the juice. I mean, they've done studies that show, at the end of life, at the end of people's lives, there's a huge study like what are your true learnings throughout your life, and they did like study over 10 to 20 years for a group of people, and what people said at the end of their lives, what really makes the most difference is our human relationships with other people. And I think that within the context of work, we have to remember that the human element is really the fundamental foundation of everything that we do. So tell me, I know you recently took on a new position. I think it's been about a year. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It's been about a year that I guess my job title changed and the scope of the team changed a little bit, but it's thematically the same, if that makes sense.
Okay. And tell us what you're doing. Like, what's your headline for your job description right now?
So over at Culture Amp, I'm the VP of Equitable Operations, and really that kind of encompasses 4 practices. So that's people operations, which you think is systems, policies, processes, mobility, compliance, equity and inclusion, sustainability, and philanthropy, or our corporate foundation. And so kind of the ESG side of the house, and then people operations. And the reason we brought those pieces together was because the more that we were doing equity work, the more we were already working on the systems and policies and processes. And we really saw kind of compliance work as like building the foundation of a great experience, performance and then the work we were doing in equity as kind of putting the roof on the house. And so for us, it was all part of the same structural picture. And we found that our teams were collaborating so much anyway, it was just easier to be one big team. And so I really love it. Like I said, I work with incredible people, but also because it lets me utilize both sides of my brain. So in many ways, the people outside of the house is really kind of structured thinking, systems, tech. And then the kind of equity side of the house, while we use those same skills, there's like a deeper kind of empathy bucket that we get to use. And so I feel like it's kind of a funny job, but it's right in my personal zone of genius, which has been one of the reasons I've been at Culture Amp so long, is I've personally been able to grow with the role in the company. And I think that's a really unique opportunity that folks don't always get.
No, I love it. And I think in an era where DEI work is actively under threat, and a lot of people are kind of asking, how do we keep these efforts, these intentions alive? It makes so much sense that DEI would be embedded in the larger systems that encompass people and culture and people operations, because DEI is about making things healthy for everyone. It's about allowing all people to perform at their best. It's not this separate thing off to the side. And I think that the more we as leaders can understand how to really integrate DEI into what we do as business, then we don't need to necessarily label it and make a big deal about it. We're just making things fair and better for everyone, period.
I think that's right. I mean, I'm again in a pretty privileged space in that Culture Amp, before I started, our CEO, the 100th hire, was a head of DEI. So it was so important that the company scale and grow in a way that encouraged equity and inclusion, that it was one of the first 100 hires, which is the earliest I'm aware of a startup founder kind of making that choice. It could have happened elsewhere, but in my knowledge. And I think that's been something I came in a little bit after that, about 5 years ago. And I've always appreciated is that at Culture Amp, the leadership isn't experts in equity and inclusion. They've certainly grown in their knowledge over the years, but what hasn't really shifted or changed is that they fundamentally believe people should be treated well at their company. And so a part of that is well-being and, psychological safety. Part of that is equity and inclusion. But the core belief is that you should be well if you're working for us. And so what do we need to put in place to achieve that? And I think that's really important, because in this kind of like DEI backlash, like, I'll be honest, I'm not that worried. And the reason is because the people who believe in it for the right reasons were the only ones who were ever going to survive the DEI boom and bust cycle anyway. And so the folks who are now saying, oh, okay, something woke, DEI, whatever, we're backing away from our commitments, the leadership didn't have the commitment that was truly there in the first place, because most of this backlash is entirely disingenuous and in bad faith. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that, like, those leaders that really were like, business case, we're going to juice our stock price by doing DEI, like, we're fundamentally unserious. That research is okay, and I really believe that it's valid. But if your reason for caring about other people's humanity is you will get richer, you do not have the resilience of commitment to make it through kind of when it's not popular.
Totally. And so this is a good segue into the next question I want to ask you, which is, a lot is changing out there. And as we step collectively into 2025, I want to know what trends or shifts in workplace culture, equity, and perhaps even our larger cultural context, because that's extremely relevant right now, are most on your mind. Like, what do you think that people and cultural practitioners most need to be paying attention to today in 2025 versus, let's say, just last year or a year before, for example?
Yeah, I think it depends on whether you're taking kind of a US or a global lens, is number one. So I think if you're focused on US, there's your resources are probably getting cut at most places. I would say I'm seeing this kind of bifurcation. So companies that didn't really care are cutting their resources. Companies who already cared are doubling down.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on which bucket you're in, your resources are either steady or growing, or they're going kind of being taken away. And I think that even in times of scarcity of resources, this work can be done, because a lot of the work doesn't have to be expensive. It's about using the right design thinking techniques to build something you already had to build. Like the work that we talked about in your book about performance management systems, is like businesses need those,
Mm-hmm.
right? But at the end of the day, your performance management system is probably the biggest DEI lever that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that's not usually how companies think about DEI. Performance management happens to be one of my areas of specialty and kind of passion. But so I think that's one of the trends, is we see this bifurcation of resource allocation.
Mm-hmm.
My hope is that a parallel trend is that employees vote with their feet. Uh, so a trend I also hope to see is I really appreciate companies who come out and say that DEI isn't a priority. I know that's a spicy opinion, but I would prefer to know where you stand and make sure your employees know where you stand so they can make the right choices for them. I also really hope, especially for US companies, start to invest in thinking about what trauma-informed processes and experiences look like. So the reality is that the new administration coming in is going to cause a lot of harm for a lot of already marginalized people. And you kind of can't turn off your personal trauma when you walk through the door at work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think it's on the individual to have like systems and strategies to support themselves, but ways to be empathetic, kind, understanding, and supportive in the workplace are also important. So I hope that we start having that conversation about what does a trauma-informed workplace look like in times of crisis. Obviously, right now, my heart goes out to the folks in LA, but that's something that is going to happen more and more, not just in a US context.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing those trends on, what you think people should be paying attention to. I definitely see see and feel the bifurcation, and it's a tough pill to swallow, because so much of what I think needs to happen long term is about reaching across this divide. But in a way, it does feel like we need to choose who we are affiliating ourselves with, and how to form alliances and allegiances very strategically, both as individuals as well as organizations, so that we are building power in a way that makes sense. Because it doesn't feel like reaching across the divide feels very practical right now. But I also love what you said about trauma-informed, using a trauma-informed lens, and with performance management in particular. I love it is the biggest lever, within an organization. And why? Like, I think it's because it's where the most resources and incentives are concentrated within a single organizational process. And one of the things I know, like as a woman of color in a corporate environment, it can be very triggering to have your labor devalued. I'm sure that many people who are tuned in and listen to this conversation have felt the sting of an unfair performance management review or process. And that can be triggering to people who have a history of traumatic experiences, especially money trauma, which is so real when your safety and security are at risk, and you come from a working class background or from poverty, then that can be really, really tough. And so I think that this is a really nice segue into our next question, which is talking about the performance management redesign, the story that you shared with me from my book. And I really want to kind of tie things together to what you said earlier about systems change needing to encompass both systems and processes, as well as helping people create safety in their bodies, like psychological safety in their bodies. And I really want to hear your insights about, especially now looking back on that performance management redesign. So for the benefit of our listeners who don't know about this, Aubrey used to work at Atlassian and spearheaded and was part of a huge performance management redesign to embed more equity into their performance management processes, like just from beginning to end. And it's a really, really cool story about inclusive design. And my question to you, Aubrey, so we can kind of dig a little bit deeper into the story and understand what's so great about it still today in 2025. So, when you led this redesign of this performance management system to make it more fair and equitable, like, talk to us a little bit about that story. What inspired the effort? How did you approach it? What lessons really stand out from this story that you think our listeners should most pay attention to today?
Yeah, so you make so many good points about performance management. And I think the other reason that I believe that, like, if your performance management system is busted, like, none of your other DEI efforts matter, is because it is the foundational process by which all of people's other opportunities at work hang off of. So it's an input to pay in almost every organization. It's an input to promotions. But as you said, it also is an assessment framework that impacts people's economic security, their livelihood, their feeling of value. So it kind of hits at all different levels. But really at Atlassian, and I think they've kind of redesigned the system since I've left. It's been a decade, but the idea was we wanted to build a new system that was more motivating and effective, but we said, like, who's going to be motivated by this as a first question, because you can't build something that works for literally everyone. So you need to say intentionally, who does this work for? And so we thought, well, we came up with a general design, and then we said, but is there bias built into this? Like, is there something inherent to the system? Knowing that humans are biased, but you can also build bias into processes. And so in addition to kind of designing what we thought made sense, we ran experiments with kind of the questions and the structure of the assessment before we rolled it live. And in a fun story, we actually ran all of our experiments using CultureAmp's Engage platform. It is not meant for that. So we kind of broke the platform to, like, run it using, like, as a research survey tool. So kind of funny that my next role is at CultureAmp. But what we actually did was we took a sample of managers and we gave them fake sort of feedback and performance reviews to summarize and write a review with the new system. And we randomized the names that were associated with the feedback. So we were actually kind of looking at gender and race, so men and women, as well as Black and white names. So there's a good amount of research that says that people can pick up race just from names. So these really subtle cues about people. And what we were able to find was that there was no kind of inherent bias in the system. So we didn't see statistically significantly different ratings for individuals based on the race or gender of the names that were being used. So that was one piece of confidence it gave us to say, like, we think this is a pretty strong underlying process. But what we also designed was a set of audit procedures. So we know that it's great that the system, we feel, is pretty rigorous, it's motivating, it doesn't seem to show any inherent bias, but humans are imperfect. And so in addition to that, we worked with the people analytics team to actually audit the outcome of those performance reviews before they were finalized, to make sure that the kind of distributions of ratings between groups were not statistically different, because that would suggest to us that there was some bias. Because at the numbers Atlassian is working with thousands of employees, you should see roughly conforming distributions between that. And so that's the same kind of process that CultureAmp uses. So CultureAmp, for example, kind of took it one step further from when I was at Atlassian, and we audit our performance, promotion, and pay processes twice a year. And we do that by 7 different dimensions of identity, as well as looking at intersectional comparisons where we have sufficient data. And so just to show that these are things that they don't require consultants, they don't require huge speaker budgets. It's just a bit of people analytics time at the right moment, making sure that that's fair, which, like, feels good and keeps our commitments. But I also think it's important to be able to go to employees and say, hey, we've done all this work to make this process as fair as possible for you. to loop back to your point, it's much easier to feel confident and be embodied when you know that someone has pre-thought about your experience, and obviously cares about you being treated equitably. That can definitely turn down kind of the activation temperature in your brain that can be more accessible for people based on their experiences.
Mm, mm. The communications piece is so important.
Yeah.
Like you're making changes to a system, why? And people need to know about that. And I think it speaks to the many hats you wear at Culture Amp. Um, no, I get a lot of reassurance knowing that a lot of performance management processes have been updated over the past few years and continue to be, um, knowing that uh, people and cultural leaders are recognizing the opportunity in improving this singular process and making it more fair. Um, Talk to me about. I want to know. So you've talked a little bit about Culture Amp and how this work has kind of continued in the 7 dimensions that you're using to really improve performance management. Tell our audience about your work at Culture Amp. Like, so you're focusing on equitable operations. Can you talk a little bit in more detail about how you're partnering with helping leaders to really improve and ramp up their not just processes but their culture overall?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different pieces to talk about, kind of to use your framework, the kind of personal, interpersonal, and systems. Is I talk a lot about the systems work that we do because it's really what our team tends to focus the most on, because we believe it's how we have the most scaled impact. And I think the basic psychology research would tell you how much of the way people behave, think, impact the world is determined by the systems they're in. So I think the other pieces of the puzzle become easier when the systems are tuned correctly. But there's also, a big project that we're working on right now is creating a more scaled way to do inclusive leadership training. So our systems work in the sense that we have a brand. We're really clear to folks coming in and when they're there that equity and inclusion is important, but we also don't assume that even someone who's well-intentioned, who's totally on board with the idea, has the skill set to actually actualize that, right? So I think it's really unhelpful for us to say, you need to be this thing, but then not to provide someone with feedback and a guide about what it means to embody that particular value. And so that's a lot of what my team is working on right now. And talking about systemic and embedding, our incredible, we call them camper people science, so kind of a classic org development team, is looking at what is our overall approach to enabling leaders to be really successful in their role. And our team's partnership model is to come in and say, and where does equity come into that? So everything from, how do we equip managers to understand the way that ableism might impact the workplace, to what types of things tend to impact Black employees the most, and what skills can you develop to address that are generally useful, to when our employees offered our accommodations and adjustments policy during their onboarding, and who's offered that. The answer to who is literally everyone, because you don't know who's disabled or you don't know who needs specific support. And so that's the kind of method, that's really addressing, leadership development is addressing that interpersonal layer. So how do you equip people with skills to collaborate well? But it's systemic in the fact that we're doing it in the context of our overall expectations of leaders. It's not leadership development and inclusive leadership development that's kind of folded into the baseline expectations.
So you're working with your clients to really, it sounds like capacity building and training that is specifically targeted to managers versus everyone, and embedding it into their existing organizational trainings and processes rather than having something extra. Am I hearing you correctly?
Absolutely. I really believe in an integrated approach. And I think for folks who have done this work, it's pretty obvious that that's more effective. But also the thing is, for folks who are saying, I'm short on time, I don't have budget, like all these very real constraints,
Yeah.
in organizations, it is faster, easier, and cheaper to run an integrated approach. And so the thing I appreciate is it's both more effective and more resource efficient. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that, like, not everything has to be a trade-off decision. Sometimes we can actually achieve multiple objectives at once.
Mm. I love what you're saying, and I'd love to also hear, like, as a follow-on question, what are your best practices for relationship building, alliance building with embedded existing leaders that own these structures and these processes? Because sometimes that can be really messy when you're coming in and saying, we have this existing process, it needs to change. It's not yours, somebody else owns it. What are some of your best practices for building those relationships and getting the right people's buy-in to make these changes in the embedded integrated systems?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is start from their values and priorities. I think it's really easy, and I will admit, guilty myself, especially as a younger practitioner, is that I really came in with an agenda about sharing my values and kind of propagating my values. And it's a really, really bad approach. Just to be honest. And what I've found as I've kind of matured as an advocate and a coach is to start and say, like, what are your existing values? And let me help you see how this stuff connects to things that are already important to you, or the way that this work can supercharge the types of things you're trying to get done. So, as an example, I was chatting to a leader the other day who doesn't have as much experience working in kind of equity and inclusion work, or leading in a way with that at the forefront. And I sort of said, well, talk to me about what you're trying to achieve this year. Like, what's the top two things that you feel like you're accountable for? And one of them was kind of a business performance metric. And I said, well, have you considered that 40% of your organization is people of color? And so if you want to get the most out of them, you want them to be able to perform at their best. And we know that the research around people feeling that they're valued and treated fairly predicts performance on the job. Like, how do you expect to meet those targets if you're not thinking about the needs of that 40% of your team? And they were like, oh, that makes sense. And so it wasn't somebody who was actively hostile. It was just that no one had actually sat down and taken them seriously as a leader with concerns and challenges and objectives. And so I share that because this is somebody who was certainly not like the most active champion. And in one conversation, you're not going to turn someone from neutral to like your biggest cheerleader most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But someone who says, yeah, I'm open to hearing more about this. What kind of enablement or support can you give me so that we can realize that? Like, that's enough of a door opening that you can do really transformative work with a team or an organization.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's really important that we don't expect everybody to meet us where we are. We have to meet people where they are.
Totally, totally. What a intuitive and like common sense approach, starting with what people value and what they want to do. And I love that you're leading with a question, like, have you ever thought about, rather than here's what you should be thinking about, is obvious, but so helpful. So let's see, I also want to, so this is probably the last question I'm going to ask you before we wrap it up. But
Yeah.
I want to know, like, we're operating in an increasingly remote and hybrid situation these days. And I'd love to hear some of your, I'm a facilitator. I'm always looking at ways to engage people better in our increasingly kind of remote fatigued environment, because there's definitely some best practices I know you probably have in terms of how you're best able to engage people who are distributed, who are remote. Talk to me and to share with our audience a little bit of your best practices with how you're able to show up and engage people.
Yeah, so I think
This way.
one of the ways that I teach is influenced by back when I was doing a PhD, which I didn't finish, I have to admit. But some of my favorite parts of that were teaching undergrads. And so I found giving people time to be introduced to a topic and think deeply about it before you spend the time getting together creates a much richer collaborative experience. So I think every facilitator in the world has like asked a question into a Zoom and like gotten complete crickets. And
Relatable.
that's one, stressful, but it's not a great learning experience for the people on the call. And so I kind of have a structure for any of the kind of online trainings, and I work with a lot of global companies. So a lot of the learning and training I do is virtual, is I'll often have about 30 to 45 minutes of pre-work before a live session. And it's often watching a video and doing some discussion questions, or even for more senior folks, I do an equitable leadership sort of coaching program for of executives, and we meet once a month, but there's actually assignments and async discussion every week. So you're coming in with a breadth of knowledge and a bit of thinking before we integrate that learning in a group setting. And then we also have follow-on work. So basically, this is not the world's most efficient way to work, but I take a lot of notes during the session, and based on questions and like the interests that I see, I compile follow-up resources for people to go through. So that's kind of my structure, is have really thoughtfully curated pre-work that introduces concepts and lets people think and digest. Use that live session, try to make it really interactive, but make it be about integration, discussion, and perspective sharing to kind of in the knowing. And then be really thoughtful about providing follow-up resources where there's interest rather than with an agenda of what people are going to learn, because it's great if they get to your favorite topics, but I think getting people further on whatever journey they're already on is ultimately going to pay more dividends. So that's kind of my approach to learning. And I find that it tends to be a bit stickier than just kind of, hey, show up to the Zoom call, we're going to talk for an hour. And not that that can't be effective, but I think that broader strategy deepens the learning.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And one of my favorite experts on facilitation, Priya Parker, always says it's all about strong opening and closing. And I think that thinking more holistically about when you're opening and when you're closing, and instead of it being bookended during that Zoom call, is actually extending that into earlier, couple weeks before the training session, and really giving people a chance to digest. And videos are great for this, right? Because people don't necessarily want to engage with a lot of like written assignments or written type of activities, but this is where making it artful, making it easy, but still giving people a chance to digest it is so helpful, both before as well as after. So I love that. Very cool tip. Thank you. So let's see. I think we're going to wrap it up. So in closing, it's been an incredible conversation about operationalizing equity. I'd love for you to share just your parting words of wisdom for our audience. So what 3 practical steps do you think leaders can take today to build fairer, more effective systems in their organizations?
So I think number 1 is find a way to expose yourself to perspectives that are more marginalized than your own. So social media can be great for this, or it can be reading. Like, think of what you're already doing in terms of your information or media environment, and intentionally add perspectives that you wouldn't run into otherwise. I think it's really hard to know what to do to be fair if you don't understand the lived experience of someone who has a marginalization you don't. So that's number 1. I think number 2 is look at the actions you're already taking and the decisions you're already making, and ask, can I do this 1% more equitably? So don't make it about doing a bunch of extra, just about taking a lens to something that's already in the flow of what you're doing or your work. And then number 3, I think spend a bit of time figuring out your own nervous system regulation techniques. And I say that because you need to be open to feedback about whether your intentions and your actions and your impact match up. And it is really activating to hear that you've done harm or that you're not being equitable or inclusive. And so to be able to take that feedback in, it really takes that embodiment and that ability to bring kind of our processing from that amygdala, from the back brain up to the prefrontal cortex or the front of the brain. So that's what my three things is: expose yourself to perspectives that will help you understand the way the world works for other people. Look at what you're already doing and ask if you can make it 1% more equitable. And then really get in touch with yourself so that you can fully take in feedback that'll help you grow and realize your intentions.
Mm-hmm. Gold. Those three things are gold. All right. So finally, what's the best way for our listeners to stay connected to you and your work, and keep tuned to what you're up to?
Yeah, so I tend to get on my soapbox quite a bit on LinkedIn. So it's just Aubrey Blanche-Sarellano. I'm the only one. And then also my website is just aubreyblanche.com. So if folks want to get in touch with me, they can just drop me a line there.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for getting on your soapbox. We need more of us on soapboxes and sharing the good word. Aubrey Blanche-Sarellano, it's been a pleasure to host you today. Thank you so much for your time. And good morning to you in Australia. I hope you have an incredible 2025. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been my pleasure. And to our dear listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Really appreciate your time today. Next week, join us on Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time for a conversation with Don Kennedy, the former superintendent of Charleston Public Schools. And he's going to share an incredible story about his work making the school and education system in Charleston, one of the most historically segregated areas in the country, more equitable and fair for educational outcomes for all children in that school system. So please tune in for that. And thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.